here at the Eno Center for Transportation, and I want to welcome you to the latest in our Eno series of webinars. Today we have a special webinar. It's our Ask the Expert series. This one's called A Very Transportation January. It certainly has been a very transportation January. Lots going on this month, and so joining us today are a few Eno experts that I'm sure are well known to you all. We have Jeff Davis, Senior Fellow and Editor of Eno Transportation Weekly, and Greg Rogers, Senior Policy Analyst and Assistant Editor, also of ETW. This Ask the Experts webinar is one of our benefits that's available only to Eno members, so thank you all for joining. The goal of this webinar is for us to share our thoughts and expertise about a set of critically important transportation topics and to engage in an interactive dialogue with all of you. Obviously, this webinar is particularly timely given the President Trump's remarks about infrastructure during the State of the Union speech last night. We'll be sure to discuss a lot of that. But also contributing to this very busy January have been things like the U.S. Chamber of Commerce's proposed 25% or 25-cent increase in the gas tax, the future of the American vision for safer transportation through advancement of revolutionary technologies, the AV START Act, a lot of movement on that in Congress, the potential return of earmarking in Congress, USDOT's new safety data initiative, and much more. So we'll have about 45 minutes for the webinar. The plan is for Jeff and Greg to start with a couple of comments, and then we will take your questions and your comments and, again, engage in an interactive discussion with you all that way. Please use the questions function on the webinar website to submit. You don't have to wait until these guys stop talking to submit questions. You can send them in at any time. I'm sure you're going to find all this very interesting and timely. Clearly, this is highly relevant to the broad national discussions that are going on. And I want to thank you all for taking the time to join us today. And with that, take it over, Jeff Davis.
Thank you very much, Rob. Last night, President Trump gave his first real State of the Union address, and it did contain a series of mentions of the infrastructure plan that his White House staff have been working on for the better part of a year. The real key date here is going to be what should by law be this coming Monday, February 5th, but they're going to miss the deadline by a week or so, the submission of the president's budget for fiscal year 2019, because that will show us the details of the infrastructure initiative, just not only in the numbers that will be coming from the White House Budget Office, but also in the thousands of pages of supplementary details in the budget estimates submitted by each DOT modal administration and each cabinet agency. Some things, the White House sent out a little fact sheet via email right about the time the president started talking infrastructure in the speech, and it confirmed what we've already had reported, that there'll be $200 billion in real federal budget authority. Half of that is going to be for those incentive grants they've discussed, and then another 25% of that, $50 billion, will be for the program for grants to rural America, because rural America largely doesn't have the throughput either in passengers or in freight necessary to utilize a lot of these financial leveraging techniques that the rest of the proposal is based around. The president also mentioned that it was going to be a $1.5 trillion plan. Now, this is kind of confusing people because last year we all talked about a $1 trillion plan. And earlier this week, I think, last week, the president mentioned 1.7 trillion before settling on 1.5 trillion in the speech last night. And some of this is easy to predict. For example, half of this real money, $200 billion, which has been consistent throughout all the iterations of the big leverage number, will be in those incentive grants that are going to have a maximum federal share of 20% of a project cost. So you can figure $100 billion as a 20% share, that has to leverage another $400 billion in other money for a $500 billion total. That part's easy. You've also got another, I think the rural money and the the $20 billion for transformative projects are probably going to have federal shares similar to what we see now, maybe up to 80%. So that can probably leverage another $100 billion or so. But then I think all the differences between the 1 trillion, 1.5 trillion, 1.7 trillion probably comes from the assumptions about the $20 billion in the bill that's going to go for existing federal credit programs, TIFIA, WIFIA, RIF, and Rural Utility Service, and the pay-go costs of the tax revenue that will not be collected because we're going to have more private activity bonds paying tax-free interest. Those of you who remember the development of the 2012 MAP 21 bill, remember that Chairman Boxer had the facto, it never stopped beating up that factoid about how that $1 in TIFIA funding would leverage up to $30 in construction of a new project. The way that she derived that factoid was, at the time, the subsidy rate of TIFIA loans is about 10%. So $1 of TIFIA budget authority could support a $10 TIFIA loan face value, and that could be up to 1/3 of the project cost. So 1 becomes 10, 10 becomes 30. There are a lot of right now. As of last year's budget, the subsidy rate for TIFIA loans was 6.64%, and that means that $1 of TIFIA today could conceivably support a $15 loan. And so already the leverage, even if you consider 1/3 of the project cost, could have jumped from 30 to 1 to 45 to 1. So there are a variety of assumptions you can put in about the subsidy rate and about what percentage of total project cost the TIFIA or RIF loan represents that can get you anywhere from, conservatively using the numbers that Senator Boxer used at 1/3 project cost with the new rates. $14 billion for TIFIA would leverage maybe $560 billion of money, but you can scale that hundreds of millions of dollars either way, depending on the assumptions you put in on the TIFIA, WIFIA, RIF, and RUS loans. Also, I'm thinking that because the tax bill that recently was enacted lowered the corporate rate from 37 to 21% and cut a few points off the rich individual rate, that's probably going to increase the bang for the buck you get on private activity bonds as well. So we'll wait to see the detailed things in the budget, but I believe that is the difference of where 1 trillion becomes 1.5, becomes 1.7, back to 1.5, are all the different assumptions, most of which are more or less equal legitimacy, because we really don't know, that are going to be plugged into those federal credit programs. The big question is, are there enough projects out there that can really take advantage of those expanded credit assistance, even if you tinker with some of the statutory limitations? I'm not quite convinced of that, but that's for purposes of getting to a $1.5 trillion number. That's how they do it. A second question has come up several times of, is this Trump program really devolution? We had this argument here at work because it both is and it isn't. On the one hand, strictly from a cost share point of view, it certainly seems that way. We're going to try to be supplementing states and transit agencies that are used to getting 80% share of programs, 50% for new subways, but 80% for most everything else. And we're going to give this extra $100 billion of incentive grants that only have a 20% share. So on the one hand, they're obviously the whole thrust of this bill is to expect states and localities to raise more of their own money or partner with private entities, raise more non-federal money. From that perspective, it seems like devolution. But from what I can tell, remember that the $100 billion in incentive grants and definitely the $20 billion in transformative grants, and then the $10 billion of the rural grants that are going to be non-formula, and then all this the $14 billion in WIFIA, TIFIA, RIF, and RUS loans. I think those are all going to be picked by Trump administration, selecting projects, whereas under the current system, the states and transit agencies actually pick almost all the projects. They select which projects to proceed with and which don't under some loose federal guidelines. And then the federal government just writes the check to reimburse them thereafter. So from a cost share perspective, it looks like devolution. From a who's in charge of picking project perspective, it looks like a massive federal reach and takeover. So it both is and isn't devolution. Now, one thing it's becoming pretty clear from the White House statement, and the fact that the president didn't mention deficits at all last night, we're probably not going to have a specific pay for allocated for this $200 billion when the budget comes out in a couple of weeks. Whether or not Congress will feel the need to add a pay for to it or run it just a deficit spending is not quite clear. But the fact that we just had a $1.5 trillion budget busting tax cut bill signed right before Christmas, and the fact that all signs point to Congress just throwing money, Republican leadership throwing money at problems in the pending FY18 year-end situation to get problems to go away, could add another $400 or $500 billion to the deficit, in the next couple of weeks. It's the bad fortune of the infrastructure bill to come along behind that. It probably won't be considered in committee until after CBO issues its revised budget forecast later in February, that's probably going to have some really scary deficit numbers. And even though we've been spending money, like rain falling out of the sky, if the deficit forecasts actually call for trillion-dollar deficits maybe in a year or so, I think you're really going to see people start to get a little skittish of those big round numbers with a lot of zeros in them, and maybe go back towards trying to do more pay for us again. In which case, the Chamber of Commerce's proposal recently to increase the gas tax by 25 cents. They proposed 5 cents a year for 5 years plus indexation, not just for inflation, but also for increased fuel efficiency in the automotive fleet out there. They said, I believe, 392 billion without putting out specific assumptions. I ran separate numbers, got 380, but somewhere in there, depending on the fact that we're already 4 months now into fiscal year 2018, and it's too late to go back to October 1st to start issuing a new tax. You got to cut off a little bit off the Chamber's numbers, but somewhere in the 380 to 390 range. Those are gross numbers. The problem with excise taxes, whether gasoline, diesel, or anything, is that any excise tax lowers the amount of taxable income that somebody somewhere has, and therefore they increase their tax deductions, and income tax rates suffer as a result of that. The rule of thumb at CBO and OMB has been to assume that income tax receipts drop by 25% of a new excise tax. So that would take maybe $95 billion from the general fund away for the 380 you put in the trust fund. However, it was pointed out to me yesterday that the fact that the corporate rate has dropped from 37 to 21% may cause CBO and OMB to revise that 25% guideline. So the effect on the general fund may be a little less now that corporate tax reform has taken over. But in any case, you have to be mindful of both numbers, not just the gross amount of a gas tax that can go to the highway trust fund, but also the effects that it will have on the general fund if you do raise the gas tax. The highway trust fund needs $140-some billion to remain stable for the rest of the 10-year budget window from now on, after the FAST Act expires at the end of this at the end of SY 2020. That's at baseline spending currently, 2020 levels plus inflation. It's not quite clear. It is clear that the first priority of this gas tax raised by the Chamber will be to stabilize the highway trust fund and prevent the pending 2021 insolvency. Beyond that, there's more money left over. The Chamber is not quite specific in what they've released so far as to whether all that money will be put into the highway trust fund construct, or whether some of it will be used as an offset for additional spending in other modes like airports or ports. But it'll all go to infrastructure somehow. However, the plan was already getting a lot of pushback. The usual suspects, Grover Norquist and Americans for Tax Reform, the Koch brothers network, and some of the Freedom Caucus guys are, of course, hostile to any kind of tax increase, including a gas tax. Speaker Ryan in the House has always been kind of skeptical of it. The Senate Public Works Chairman John Barrasso has said he doesn't think it's a good idea. Senate Majority Whip John Cornyn has also said he doesn't think it's a good idea. So you're not getting unanimous buy-in from Republican legislators, at least. Democrats would probably vote for it if they were certain that if they liked the spending it was going to put forward and were sure it was going to go through. But they're also not particularly inclined to bail Republicans out of any kind of fiscal jam they get themselves in at this point. So, and in this case, we're going back to what we said at the beginning. The budget's coming out the week of February 12th, and it's going to be key to look and see what the budget assumes is going to happen to the Highway Trust Fund after 2020, and also if they're going to persist in trying to abolish New Starts and Tiger grants and cut Amtrak funding immediately in the discretionary budget starting in 2019. If they do, then you're going to have to mentally reduce the $200 billion of real money they're proposing for their new infrastructure bill by the amount that they're proposing to cut Tiger and New Starts, and by the amount they're proposing to cut Highway Trust Fund programs after 2020. So that's what I saw last night and had been thinking on the last week or so.
That's great. Thanks very much, Jeff. That's a great overview. Clearly, there's a lot baked in there. And we've got a couple questions that have started to come in. We'll take those in just a minute. I want to remind everybody else to go ahead and use the question function on the webinar website to ask your own questions or your comments. We'll take those in just a minute. I want to now turn it over to Greg Rogers. Greg has been paying attention to a lot of the doings on Capitol Hill, and particularly as it relates to this transformation around transportation technology and everything related to autonomous vehicles. So, Greg, why don't you take over?
Great. Thanks, Rob. As Rob mentioned, we're seeing a lot of movement on the autonomous vehicle bills in Congress. The House Autonomous Vehicle Bill, or AV bill, Self-Drive Act, sort of zoomed through the House last year, passing with unanimous support out of the subcommittee and then the committee and then the full House. But on the Senate side, there was a little bit of a holdup after the Senate Commerce Committee passed the bill by voice vote. What happened was Senator John Thune, who chairs Senate Commerce, he initiated the hotline process, which requires unanimous consent to bring the bill to the floor, and would make it a lot easier to sort of get it to the floor rather than trying to elbow around for floor time. But what's happened since then is, or almost immediately afterwards, where there are multiple holds that were placed by senators on both sides. One of the most major Republican ones was from Roger Wicker, as we reported in ETW, was over auto dealers and their franchising rules, and that was lifted pretty quickly. And Thune and Peters, Senator Gary Peters from Michigan, who co-wrote the bill with Thune, has been negotiating with a lot of the other holds. There were several Democratic ones that are rather strong. Now we're down to 2 strong Democratic holds, and then one softer one. One of the strongest ones right now that's causing the most concern is from Senator Dianne Feinstein from California. Feinstein is concerned that autonomous vehicles on crowded roads like those in California will be fundamentally unsafe. It seems that this is more of a fundamental distrust of the technology. She wants to make sure that they are tested off of public roads and proven, which is a significant challenge. And what appeared recently as well as Senator Kristen Gillibrand from New York also rose objections to the bill. This is sort of similar to Feinstein's, but the real issue here is for her is preemption of state laws. You may recall, or if you were tracking this, New York State has one of the most restrictive testing testing requirements for autonomous vehicles. And if you calculated out what they did, it was they created a requirement that a manufacturer has to pay for a police escort while they're driving their autonomous vehicle in New York, and that would actually come out to around $2,055,000 for Waymo if they moved all of their 2016 AV testing from California to New York. But there are rumblings that Governor Cuomo is actually about to make some changes to that soon. And then the last hold that's notable is from Senator Blumenthal from Connecticut. He's concerned about whether or not an AV can operate without having some sort of backup driver. He proposed an amendment during the markup that would require that every autonomous vehicle, even if it was meant to be fully driverless, has driver controls, basically creating a driverless car bill that requires a driver. But it seems that they've negotiated through this. The resolution seems like it might be to include sort of remote operation as a area within the safety evaluation report and AV start. And what that is the safety evaluation report requires manufacturers to tell NHTSA everything that their vehicle does and to show how they're ensuring safety. And he might ask for having some sort of remote operation capability in the vehicle for if someone is far, where the manufacturer can have someone in a room somewhere that can basically take remote control of the vehicle to make sure it's safe if the AV encounters a situation it cannot deal with. Schumer and McConnell have both been tapped to get involved in this. Schumer especially for interacting with Gillibrand and sort of massaging out those issues. And Thune has spoken with McConnell about getting floor time in the next couple of months. It sounds like there is a lot of cautious optimism that this will pass out of the Senate within the next month or two. And then it will go to conference. Already the House and Senate staff have started sort of pre-conference negotiations on the less tricky parts, i.e. not preemption, not exemption. And the last part is that Markey and Heller Ed Markey proposed an amendment at the markup as well on data privacy. I believe one on cybersecurity as well. But Markey and Dean Heller have reached sort of an agreement to propose an amendment on data privacy when the bill does come to the floor. And one thing that just did land in my inbox that I wanted to note was the California Department of Motor Vehicles just released 19 reports about reports about 19 manufacturers' disengagements of their autonomous vehicles while testing. This is released every year, required under California state law, and goes back to sort of the question of what this federal structure is here, because states are currently exerting quite a bit of influence over how AVs are tested. We're going to move on to the U.S. DOT and Data Initiative. This is an exciting new sort of project that's being taken on by Secretary Chow, and the number 3 at U.S. DOT, Derek Kahn, announced this at TRB a couple weeks ago. And what this is it's taking all of the data sets that DOT has been collecting for generations, about 800 or so, on every single mode of transportation, and using 21st century analytics to understand what are the causes of fatalities in different transportation modes. This is going to be sort of this 3-point plan. The first one is bringing in tech firms to do data visualizations. The second one is to integrate with companies like Waze to understand what things might lead to accidents, whether this is poor weather, whether this is poorly maintained roads, other factors such as driving at night in rural areas. And the third part is a little bit more ambitious, which is preparing for artificial intelligence. The way that this is going to work initially is that DOT is going to take the Fatality Analysis Reporting System, or FARS. What this is when police officers report to a crash that was fatal, they fill out this huge spreadsheet full of all kinds of factors that were leading to the crash, but these are mostly the immediate factors. And DOT is instead going to take a step back and say, okay, how can we compare this with other data sets? And how can we look at sort of the hot spots where collisions are happening? Because 3 things lead to crashes most of the time, and this is pretty well known. It's speeding, it's driving under the influence, and it's not wearing a seatbelt. DOT and state partners and local partners have already really brought down the amount of people who are not wearing seatbelts to about 90%. It's hard to get that other 10%, but there are other things that they can do that might be more cost effective to actually get there. And so this is the goal of this project. I'd recommend keeping an eye on it as we move forward.
That's great. Thanks very much, Greg. So clearly there's a lot going on. Clearly there's a lot of expertise here in this room. So let's turn to some questions now. I'm going to try to bucket some of these. I'd encourage you to continue to submit them via the questions function on the webinar website. Let me start with one very directly for you, Jeff. So the question is whether there's any thoughts about Frelinghuysen's retirement from the Appropriations Committee and any impact that might have on Gateway or any other appropriations issues.
Chairman Rodney Frelinghuysen from New Jersey, chairman of the House Appropriations Committee, announced abruptly this week that he was going to be retiring, not running for re-election this year. And the committee staff found out when the Bergen Record called them. So it was very abrupt, but not completely unexpected, just because the tax bill really did him in. The New Jersey has some of the highest income taxes in America, and the property taxes in his district, even for middle class people, are just off the hook. So the restrictions on state and local tax deduction have pretty much killed his chances for re-election. He voted against the tax bill twice, but it still became law. This probably won't affect the funding that he put in the FY18 bill that's in House Senate conference omnibus negotiations now. They generally, once the House and Senate have actually voted to pass something, and he managed to direct $900 million more or less to Gateway, without violating the earmark ban, which is very cleverly done. But even if the person retires, in the middle, he's still chairman of the end. So it won't affect negatively any of the prospects for the Gateway money in FY18. Starting in FY19, who knows? It's going to be probably a Texan or an Alabama or somebody like that who's a little less enthused about having Gateway jump to the head of the class. But Yeah, it won't affect. And also, I would say that the numbers that are being thrown around for adding to the FY 18 and 19 appropriations budgets by Republican leaders for non-defense, they're talking as high as $62 billion a year. Transportation HUD usually gets about 10% of that. So if you put another $5 or $6 billion in the transportation HUD bill, no need for new start cuts, no need for anything, no need for a contract authority rescission, gravy for everybody. So both the House and Senate passed appropriations bills for 18. Those big decisions may get superseded by a flood of new money coming in. I also want to mention one thing I just got on the Twitter, that the House and Senate Republicans are in a retreat at the Greenbrier. Their Amtrak train hit a garbage truck outside Charlottesville at a grade crossing, so they had to get off the train and go by bus. But at 10 o'clock tomorrow morning, the House and Senate Republicans who are going to have a closed-door session on the infrastructure package, moderated by John Thune, and the participants will also be Secretary Chao, EPW Chairman Barrasso, TNI Chairman Schuster, and Gary Cohen from the NEC. So hopefully they're going to come to some kind of internal decisions tomorrow on how to treat this bill, and we'll be able to get some feedback on that moving forward.
That's great. So let me go back to Greg. We asked bundle some questions here around the AV discussion. What do you expect is going to happen if the bills pass authorizing large numbers of AV exemptions? What do you think is going to happen? What's going to be a result of that?
Yeah, I think the first thing to consider here is that whenever autonomous vehicle developers request exemptions, what they need to do is they need to actually prove in some way that their vehicle is just as safe or safer than vehicles that are currently complying with federal motor vehicle safety standards, which is required for all vehicles to be operated on public roads. The challenge is that there currently isn't a process for determining this when we're talking about vehicles that have exemptions, vehicles that might not have steering wheels or brake pedals or gas pedals. NHTSA still doesn't have sort of this way to do it. And this might be a big challenge, actually, because currently manufacturers limited only 2,500 exemptions per model year, or maybe calendar year. But when we're looking at that, just 2,500 is not enough to hit scale when we're talking about deploying a large number of driverless fleets, truly driverless fleets, that is, without a driver in the seat. So what these bills will do is increase the exemption cap to somewhere between 80 to 100,000, depending on which one passes, which means that a company like GM could scale up autonomous vehicle services, sort of like operating driverless cars almost as robotaxis, to multiple cities. And this is already the plan of General Motors with its AV developer Cruise. GM actually filed for an exemption for its fully driverless vehicle. It sent this in to NHTSA earlier this month. It was a 500-page document that tried to explain for the first time and set a precedent for how these exemption evaluations will be done. So it's worth noting then that getting exemptions is going to take time. AVs aren't going to be flooding the streets anytime soon. And this is going to take not a long time just for NHTSA to sort of develop this process for evaluating vehicles, make sure they're safe, but also for manufacturers to scale up production. And GM is certainly in a place to do that, and there are many other companies that are, but the technology still isn't there, and we're still pretty far away from seeing this flood of AVs on the streets.
I think it's a good point. Not made enough. I think it's not happening tomorrow. We could do things today, but it's not happening tomorrow. A question again back to you, Jeff. I think folks seem to be surprised at this idea of returning to earmarking. Can you describe kind of where are we now on that, and what's behind the motivation behind maybe bringing earmarks back for transportation?
There were a number of rank and file members of the House who have suggested bringing back earmarks, to the point that Speaker Ryan requested that the House Rules Committee under Chairman Jeff Sessions hold some hearings on whether or not it'd be a good idea and what could be done. So Sessions held 2 days of hearings, one day with just House members testifying and one day with outside experts testifying. The witness list appeared stacked on the outside witnesses against earmarking. You had several Citizens Against Government Waste and Taxpayers Common Sense and some Texas Freedom Caucus type guys who were kind of rude in their testimony. The only person who testified in favor of it was from the Bipartisan Policy Center, I believe. But it's out there partly because there are programs like New Starts, for example, that no one ever thought that when setting up the statute that runs them, that a president might come around and just refuse to run the program. And the fact that the Trump administration is refusing to run the New Starts program the way that Congress clearly intended it to be run, and the fact that the appropriations committees have trouble forcing them to without violating the earmark ban for these New Starts that have been in the pipeline for a long time, obeying the law and getting their initial preliminary engineering done and the alternatives analysis, et cetera. So that's part of it. And partly it's a matter of trust. Earmarks have always been about a lack of trust. If Congress trusted the federal executive branch or their state DOT to pick the right project in their area and spend money wisely, there wouldn't be much of a need for earmarks. And it doesn't take much to realize that trust between the legislative and executive branch is at an all-time low. So there's that as well. But it would be really problematic because of the excesses of the Safety Lou law and the Duke Cunningham and other scandals that happened about the same time that are the reason that Republicans decided to give up earmarks in the first place. Every time you want to bring them back, someone just drugs up news stories from that era that sort of push back at it. And the people who claimed they wanted to drain the swamp when they came to Washington are in particular really not looking forward to having to go back to their constituents and explain, well, we brought back earmarks, by the way. So, but that's basically what's going on. It would require both House and Senate to go along with this, and I'm not sensing a lot of enthusiasm for it at the leadership level, even though in some instances it would make bills easier to pass, probably.
Like the transportation bill.
Yeah, Safety Lou, the bill that bankrupted the Highway Trust Fund, passed by the House like 400 to, was it 12 maybe, because it was so little down with earmarks. So even though the bill clearly put the Highway Trust Fund on a path to insolvency, it didn't matter as much as the earmarks did.
So not impossible, but certainly not likely anytime soon. This is for both of you, maybe Greg for this one. Do you think that the U.S. DOT data initiative is going to enable assessment and impact data which we use to determine infrastructure investments and funding amounts or co-share levels? So can that data, which we talked about as being used to determine the cause of accidents, can it be used for investment priorities, I guess?
Yeah, I mean, there's an indication from within US DOT that this data could be useful in determining where funding could be allocated through grants or through other initiatives that they might be able to bring to Congress to discuss. But really the goal here is to be able to form a more complete picture of what it is that's leading to collisions and start those conversations with state and local and even regional sort of entities to work on these issues. For example, let's say that US DOT visualizes all of this data, puts in this visualization, and you see on the maps that a lot of collisions are happening in rural areas. And rural areas are actually where most collisions happen. It's something like it's over 50% of collisions happen in rural areas for a disproportionately smaller community. So DOT right now this is still in its infancy. This is still something that they're working on. They're still trying to figure out who are we going to work with on doing this. They're talking major tech firms, but the plan is to eventually be able to form different working groups with state and local entities that have issues in common, and then figure out what solutions they can use in order to reduce fatalities.
Let's Jeff, let me go back to you. There's some questions about obviously paying for the infrastructure bill, and some questions about two additional pay-fors that may be being considered right now by some members of Congress for the infrastructure package. Maybe repatriation. Mnuchin said that he liked that, and the increase in non-defense spending cap that they're currently considering. Any thoughts on additional pay-fors for the infrastructure package? Budget-wise,
we may have missed the boat on repatriation. it would have been nice to have done that in tax reform, but the minute that the congressional leaders decided to do tax reform via the budget reconciliation process instead of regular order, so they could do it 51 votes instead of 60, that meant it was against the rules to direct repatriation money to the Highway Trust Fund and the tax bill, because that would have caused the whole bill to require 60 votes instead of 51. So the minute they did reconciliation, we lost the ability to do that in the Highway Trust in the tax bill. You could go along now and pass a law that says, yeah, that money repatriation that we raised in the fourth quarter of 2017 in the tax bill, we'll devote that to the Highway Trust Fund. But it's not new money at that point. The money's already on the books. It'll be built into the baseline that OMB and CBO come out with next month. And so redirecting existing money to pay for new spending is fundamentally not the same thing as raising new money to pay for new spending. And there are a lot of budget problems that would come with that. The other item is more promising. Republicans are having to offer the Democrats tens of billions of dollars in extra non-defense spending in order to get Democratic buy-in on $70 billion a year in extra defense spending. Republicans supposedly have suggested in these talks that most of this 50, 60 plus billion dollars per year in non-defense spending go towards infrastructure. Whether we're not sure whether it would be appropriated money or whether it would be a cap adjustment. You have overseas contingency operations right now that's a workaround that's exempt from the cap, and you have disaster relief that's a separate sort of cap adjustment that's exempt from the cap. You could start a infrastructure cap adjustment. You'd have to define which budget accounts get to be part of that and which don't. That's the first problem, because it's one of the reasons we could never have a capital budget on the federal level, because once you decide to do that, everybody and their cousin's going to claim their project is capital. Oh, we're human capital or whatever. And so everybody and their cousin's going to claim their account as infrastructure if you do that. But second of all, the problem is the appropriations committees have always hated this. Someone was reminding me the other day of back when the T-21 law in 1998 created separate budget categories for highway and transit, how much the appropriations committees hated that and fought it tooth and nail until finally the caps were allowed to expire in 2003. So the appropriations committees like being given one lump sum of money, and they're the ones in charge of figuring out what percentage of that money goes to what agency, program, function, et cetera. And so the appropriators have been really fighting that behind the scenes. I'm not sure if they'll fight it enough to turn down $60 billion a year in money, but we'll see. But that is the prospect of getting a special dispensation for infrastructure in the ongoing omnibus negotiations probably has more likelihood of success than retroactively pretending that we dedicated last year's repatriation money to the Highway Trust Fund.
That's great. Let me go back to you one more for you, Greg. Question around the bill. So if the AV stalls in the 115th Congress, how's it going to affect preemption and the AV timeline? Any ideas about what that would mean?
Yeah, effectively, the preemption language in AV Start and in self-drive as well, I mean, they differ structurally in a number of ways, but the important part here is these bills aren't really doing anything new on preemption. It's just reinforcing the traditional federal role of regulating design, construction, performance of vehicles, while states have a whole lot of other things that they manage, insurance and licensing drivers, registering vehicles, enforcing traffic laws, maintaining roadway infrastructure. And then cities have a similarly large role to play. But there have been some moves in some cities like Chicago to just ban AVs outright. And this preemption language could effectively prevent that from happening. But this doesn't prevent a city from enforcing its traffic laws. This doesn't prevent a city from holding AV manufacturers responsible for violating traffic laws or for operating in an unsafe way. I think that's the important part to remember on preemption, because it's often turned into the P word as being something that is actually sort of a curse on states and cities, but it takes a lot of resources to manage vehicle standards. So effectively, these bills not passing is also about regulatory uncertainty. Manufacturers want to be sure that they're developing these vehicles, that they'll be able to put them on the road, and that they won't be subject to fines in any given number of cities or states. So it could slow down AVs by 3-5 years. And this is also an issue of national economic competitiveness, which is kind of came up in Congress a lot. It was actually in President Trump's national security plan in December. So it's worth noting that this is also about economic competitiveness, which leads into national security, and that's how the administration is looking at it. As China is making big strides in AVs, and so is Singapore. And in both of these cases, the governments have a bit more leverage and have put more investments in AV technology.
Great. Let's do one more. We're just about out of time. So, Jeff, if there is another CR, looking maybe likely, that sets up a showdown with the debt limit, does the infrastructure plan disappear? What does it mean if there is another one of these budget crises in a few weeks?
Last CR expires midnight February 8th, and it's already looking too late to have a budget deal, an omnibus, ready to go by February 8th. So the hope would be that they could get a handshake deal at least on the new budget framework, how much extra for defense, how much extra for non-defense, which are the other odds and ends you're going to throw in there. Get that ready to go, and one last CR for a couple of weeks to buy the Appropriations Committee's time to write a $1.2 or $1.3 trillion appropriations bill. But the problem is, you're right, that after February 8th, there's not that many weeks left till the end of February, and the Treasury announced yesterday or today that the new deadline for the debt limit is looking to be right around the end of February. So that'll be something else that'll have to get rolled in there. I don't think it means the end of the infrastructure bill. They'll still try to consider something, but the fact is that the more budgetary problems that happen between now and the time the infrastructure bill goes to committee make it more difficult to do it without a pay-for. And once you start trying to find a pay-for, I'll also mention there are a few other usual suspect pay-fors that Congress uses in things like this, extending mandatory budget sequestration after 2024 or whatever, and a few things like that. But those are probably all going to get used up trying to offset the costs of whatever is going to be happening in this last big package. Don't forget, a lot of things going on. The CBO scored the DREAM Act as costing $26 billion because once you put people on a path to citizenship, they become eligible for some means-tested programs they're not eligible for. And there's a few rogue tax extenders like the short line tax credit and the energy stuff that are still floating around there trying to get retroactively enacted. And Sherrod Brown won't give up on the Teamster Central States Pension Fund, and a lot of things are clamoring for attention in this year-end Christmas tree. Even it's Christmas in February, and so it doesn't necessarily mean the end of the infrastructure bill, but it will postpone it until summer. But I don't think that waiting to go through committee for another 3 or 4 weeks would necessarily hurt it. It's more the worse the global fiscal situation gets, the harder it is to do infrastructure without paying for it.
I was going to say that's good news, and that's not really clear whether it's good news or bad news, but it's clearly complicated. And so I want to thank you guys, Jeff and Greg, for joining us today. I think folks on the phone clearly recognize there's a lot of expertise here in this room, a lot of expertise here at this organization. These are super complex issues that we've been wrestling with for the last few months, so we're going to continue to wrestle with. So please continue to use these two guys and this organization as a resource for all these complicated matters. And I want to thank you all for participating in this conversation. We've had a really great turnout, particularly from our alumni and our other members. So thank you for joining us here today. As I said, Eno's going to stay engaged in a lot of these different issues. Please stay engaged with us as we go forward. Once again, I want to thank you all for your participation. Have a great afternoon, everybody.